All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Miriam Hewitt. I am Assistant Director at the Center for Public Service. And this is the CPS Speaker Series. Today's talk is led by Dr. Rosanne Adderley, and it's titled Black Community Creators and Historical Records for the People, a midterm report on CPS/History/Africana Studies partnership with the Mardi Gras Indian Council of New Orleans. Dr. Adderley actually received the 2021 Center for Public Service Faculty Community Engaged Research Grant for this project, and her proposal was titled Mardi Gras Indian Traditions, Going Global and Going Online, a digital humanities project on African diaspora masking cultures in New Orleans and the greater Caribbean. Dr. Adderley is Associate Professor of African Diaspora History and also an affiliate member in Africana Studies and in the Stone Center for Latin American Studies. Her own research work mostly concerns Black experience during the years of slavery around the Americas, with particular interest in the Caribbean Basin and in the 1700s and 1800s. Most of her published writing focuses on the years around the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade and the ending of slavery in the 1800s. She's most interested in how Black people themselves watched these changes with their own eyes and their value system. She started graduate school in history back in 1989, though with much bigger general questions around why Black cultures looked one way in Haiti, for example, and a significantly different way in Georgia or Alabama. What parts of the histories of African enslavement and its aftermath shaped those differences in Black culture? The project with the Mardi Gras Indian Council seeks in part to connect histories of Black masquerade traditions between the Caribbean and New Orleans. At Tulane, Professor Adderley teaches a wide rotation of courses in African American history, Caribbean history, and comparative Black diaspora history. She has had a local and regional nonprofit experience on the board of the Amistad Research Center in the early 2000s with Amnesty International and several other justice-seeking organizations, and also with charitable projects connected to the Episcopal Church. She holds academic degrees in Latin American studies and history, but for any students in this audience, at least 25% of what she does every day with this and other projects literally did not exist when she was earning those degrees. And thank you so much for being here, Dr. Adderley. I will pass it on to you.
Fantastic. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Miriam, for arranging and for always being there for me. The high point far and away of this grant so far for me has been the day that a lot of things were going wrong, like many things in terms of relationships, in terms of technical things, in terms of money, in terms of planning, and it was raining because it's New Orleans and it rains. And I somehow managed to kidnap Miriam, and we ended up sitting on the steps inside Stern because it was raining so hard that the rain was driving into the breezeway. And we went through my whole summer research and the future travel plans for Mardi Gras Indian Council and relationship building, and redid the structure of 8,000 things. And, so I have nothing but gratitude for just the partnership of CPS. And one day I will be able to write down fully as a full report, all the moving parts that makes this thing possible. Much to my horror, I have officially 28 things to say, but I want to leave time for questions. I will say, and this is important for how we think about this project, is my own relationship with the Center for Public Service at Tulane began, I think, in the spring of 2007, doing something that was obviously useful, all right, in the long aftermath of all that, of the post-Katrina floods in New Orleans. Students in modern African American history class worked with ACORN, putting together housing information fairs for mostly African American residents of New Orleans, in the city. This was clear, useful work. Students started off their history course reading the historically minded sociologist Kristen Lavelle and Joe Fagan's essay Hurricane Katrina, the race and class debate, and then they went out and worked on the aftermath. I'm not sure yet that there exists a brilliant historical sociology article on Black cultural traditions in New Orleans popular culture, the race and class debate. If that sociology article exists, someone send it to me or someone write it. And that's not even my particular interest of expertise, but most of my service learning work has actually not been in these kind of obviously useful venues. It's been much more thinking about how things that we might call, and we've had a lot of discussion about this recently, public history or public humanities, how they can fit within the mission of the Center for Public Service and service learning models. How they fit in, it may be not so obvious, because people often ask, and indeed many of my colleagues ask, at the front end of service learning, where do we fit into this? Thank the Lord, the communities that I exist, enslaved people don't exist anymore. All right, actual enslaved people, what is the content of a lot of my classes? So it's not obvious, but it is a really straightforward path, because many of the things, maybe most of the things, and I see some people from our various archives on campus here, maybe most of the things we want in our public history, and they know this, are either unevenly funded, unreliably funded, reliant on donors, limited public funding. And one of the things that I was thinking about before this project are what are the ways that university students in a service learning model can help certain kinds of public history happen that might not happen otherwise. And what we were particularly interested in with this partnership with the Mardi Gras Indian Council is how we can make that kind of public history two things: sustainable and based in communities, often marginalized by wealthier public history entities. All right. If you want me to bash wealthy entities, Tulane, the Art Museum, I can do that some other day. But I will talk a little bit about resources. And I'm not an expert in either museums or public history or their funding streams or how smaller entities can get access to those funding streams. All right. This project developed organically and comes almost entirely from the vision of Bertrand Butler, the director of the Mardi Gras Indian Council. All right. It's pretty obvious to anyone with eyes that none of the stuff we're talking about today is possible without the people who have actually sustained these traditions by actually making them happen, creating students, participating in these communities, making this music. That's the obvious part. But it's hard to overstate the wisdom and true vision of Mr. Butler and his work. The idea of a Mardi Gras Indian Council is something that dates back to the 80s. And if people have questions about how it thinks about itself, so I'll say a little bit more of that, but this isn't a presentation on its history. But it's Mr. Butler that came to us about like what it means to think about your traditions and think about their records and think about having community-based control over it. So it's his untiring work, the work of MGIC Assistant Director Michael Farley, Chief Howard Miller of the Creole Wild West, who's both around the corner from the Cultural Center, Chief Tyrone Casby of the Mohawk Hunters. And these have been our principal educators in trying to make our university-based selves useful over the past 5 years. And it's been 5 years. In all cases but one of the people that I've named, they have been working to make what is happening with the Mardi Gras Indian Cultural Campus possible for longer than I have been alive. And I turned 56 a month ago. All right. So they've been at this for a long time. My students, I think, mostly do not believe that this has all been made possible, either when they see Indians on the street or when they see their many institutions in this community, not just the council, that all of this has happened without significant, massive funding streams or government support. The most common thing I said to my service learning students is there's no staff there, because they just, they wanted to be able to call and ask someone questions and drop by and go, I was like, that's not, this, and they literally, as newcomers to the city and as young learners, they're like, this cannot be all happening just out of, this kind of volunteer effort. This should not be the case, obviously. That's a conversation for another day. I would say that the most unequivocally useful part of the CPS grant, and it's something for faculty and colleagues who are here, is that 30% of this grant is reserved for Mardi Gras Indian Council to dedicate toward on-site labor services in whatever way they see fit. what we have been able to witness over the past 3 years, and I'm sorry, I did not, and I don't have, I have a handful of images, not a lot, an image of the actual cultural campus, which is at 4th and LaSalle in Central City. We've watched that site turn the corner. Some Tulane architecture folks have had some roles in that, but one of the to quote the assistant director, the Mardi Gras Indian Council was a thing without an address. All right, and there are many, as most of you know, there are many independent Indian entities of various kinds around the city, run for various ways, from museums, for both particular tribes, particular communities. The idea behind the council was that there should be some kind of, not boss of all the Indians, that's not the nature of this tradition, but something that would be like anybody involved in these traditions can essentially turn to the council for curating their records, preserving their traditions. And I'll say a little bit more about that. That was the idea, but it literally didn't have a space. And the picture that I had, and I just ran out of time, is that they actually cut the ribbon and did a kind of soft opening of the cultural campus on Friday, March the 13th, 2020. Think on these things. There's a beautiful Friday, March the 13th, 2020. For the record, that was like, pandemic day 0. Like 2 hours later was when New Orleans shut down, when the city made the declaration. And there's gorgeous pictures of 2 Africana studies interns who'd been working, doing video at the site. We were a bunch of happy campers, and it's unfunny. But it's so ironic that we'd worked so hard to get a location so people could have a physical location that they knew that the council was trying to do its work, and even if it wasn't open, and then it closed. All right. But as my favorite poem, second favorite poem, I won't say my first favorite because it's dark, is a Scottish poem, Tam O'Shanter. If any of you don't know it, it's a funny poem, and he goes on for a long period, and then in the middle he says, "Now for our story." I've come for the now for our story part of my talk. All right. And I've divided this up into both why am I here, what the council asked us to do, what have we been doing, who have we been doing it with, and where are we? The why am I here, and Miriam, do I have screen sharing capacity?
Yes, you should.
Okay, let me see if I can. If I can't, now that you all know my precise age, y'all know perfectly well that I'm an analog sort of creature. Come on.
I can see it.
Yes, but I cannot. But what it's not letting me do is move it. Wait, don't. Et voila. This is the main reason why I'm here. That is from the Carnival Museum of Trinidad and Tobago. All right, Black Indians of Trinidad. The 4 little background pieces to why I'm here, and there are 4. There's pre-Lenten carnivals all over the world. A former priest of mine from New Orleans, I'm an Episcopalian, not a Roman Catholic, sent me some fantastic images from Italy. And as with most Christian festivals, and I don't mean to give offense to any devout people on this presentation, these activities have been merged time and again with various local cultures that were there before Christianity arrived, or things that arrived later. Like the idea that the Christian calendar is somehow like real, it's not a thing. It's meaningful, but it's not, it's so this merging tradition in the Americas, including here in New Orleans, in Brazil, in Trinidad. All right. As well, you have these pre-Lenten carnivals that developed into epic masking and performance festivals around both this pre-Lenten period, but other parts of the Christian calendar year, on 3 Kings Day in early January. Some happen around Christmas. Someone once asked me, this is on tape, why are these regional carnival traditions so magical in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in Brazil? It's on tape if you want to listen to me say it. I think the documentary is called Race, and it's about electoral politics in New Orleans, and these French documentarians were wandering around during Carnival asking people about race. But what I said, and they asked, you're a historian, why is the Carnival this way? And what I said to them was that the roots of these epic and extraordinary traditions, at least you apparently needed 2 ingredients. Roman Catholicism, or at least some other devoted European colonizer, was pretty committed to their Christian calendar, all right, following their religious calendar. And you needed large number of enslaved Africans from West and West Central Africa. Those are the two things that made these traditions so epic. Follow the history of slavery. All right. I have a US history colleague, a Southern historian, and he says a part of our job as historians of slavery Black experience is in part to ruin Carnival. All right. The idea that this is some generic moment of liberty and celebration, and aren't these traditions wonderful and magical and special? And oh gosh, we don't want to talk about slavery. It's gonna come as a shock, I'm sure, to all of you, that far more students are interested in signing up for Caribbean culture as a class than are interested in signing up for Black enslavement. Shocking. It's not shocking. All right, these are hard things. The new language that we're using, and I'm not sure I like it, is hard histories. But when we talk about comparing New Orleans history with the Caribbean, with Latin America, what we're talking about is comparing horrendous histories of European colonialism, slavery, racism, and there's no getting around that. There's no magic, there's no secret to why you see that image on the screen from Trinidad down in the Southern Caribbean, and you're like, wow, that looks kind of like New Orleans. There's no magic, there's a real simple answer to how we got there. Quick thing about the Christian calendar and the language that I am using. There are lots of debates here and elsewhere about the good reasons to try to loose the language cords that tie Black cultural traditions to that Christian calendar. If I see an Igbo Abakwa descended masker on the streets of Havana on Dia de los Reyes, Three Kings Day, Christian calendar, 3 kings visited baby Jesus, all right? Boy, if we call that a 3 Kings festival, something about its Igbo-ness is lost. We all know this here. There's a rich conversation going on about the difference between saying Mardi Gras Indians and saying Black masking Indians. That the Mardi Gras Indians language ties it to something, Mardi Gras or Christmas, when these things, especially when done by Africans and their descendants, were not precisely a Mardi Gras or a Christmas thing. I'm happy to talk about this more. It's complicated because, people use this language and the words mean the words, and so they've used like Black community creators in Cuba and, have called things, 3 Kings Day things, and we've called things Mardi Gras Indians here. So that it's not the language, it's not like someone came along and said, you must call it that thing. But I don't want us to overlook, all right, that the force of that language. And even, I will say this, the time it's most obvious to my students is when I show them the pictures of Abakwa in 1800s Cuba, right next to contemporary images on 3 Kings Day. They must have believed it because there's not enough Igbo in their everyday life for them to really wrap their minds around and the other thing here, and I'll have a little bit more to say about this, is it also gets wound into all this other quote unquote generic Mardi Gras thing. On a related point, and I do want to, I'm trying to be attentive to my time. Second best paper I wrote as a graduate student, and I still can't remember where I ripped this quote off from, but the language referred to power in the mask and in its wearing. African people who came to the Americas had their own religious and cultural beliefs, all right, and some pretty profound ones about what both certain kinds of masks meant and what a mask meant in general. All right. If the Martians come and kidnap us all and drag us off to Mars for us, there's a brilliant essay about this by Derek Bell, the legal critical race theory scholar. Oops, I've said critical race theory. And we see a Star of David on Mars. We're going to make assumptions about its connection to Judaism. All right. And the way you want to think about this is these West Africans, they come from traditions where masking means a thing, where certain aesthetic things mean, where to layer fabric in a certain way means a thing. And they didn't just pour all that stuff out of their heads. And that's the other thing to remember about this. So when we talk about what African descended people did with masking on whatever day of the year, Mardi Gras, the day after Christmas, 3 Kings Day, whatever, it is not, and this is one of the things that makes me crazy. It's not that there was a white-led Christian holiday, and because of slavery and segregation, white people did some things over here in their white spaces, and Black people enslaved and post-slavery did things over here. There's other meaning going on and how they did the thing, All right. And many of you will have seen the beautiful exhibit about this that just was done by on a spiritual meaning, and it was at the Cabildo, and it's been shown in France about this. I want us to think about all of these things. Last thing on background, then I'll get to the meat of what we've been doing. We often really want clear explanations as to, quote, why we have a masking tradition in New Orleans that involves African Americans invoking significantly indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples' aesthetics and histories. All right. For example, we want to say, and one of the first things people said to me, and I said, there's got to be more than that. They were like, well, Black people saw these Wild West shows and admired Plains Indians' maintenance of culture and resistance to colonialism, or the official one explanation: Black people celebrated indigenous people because of their regular harboring of Africans who fled enslavement and European colonial oppression. All right. Or Black people celebrated First Nations for all of these reasons. And the answer is, it's complicated. It's all of the above. All right. And I don't want us to, I don't, at least not for this project, neither me nor the Mardi Gras Indian Council is particularly bogged down in getting to that why. All right. There is obviously no one reason. And since we are working on it in terms of thinking about, like, what's the first time anyone gave them a reason. All right. And we listen to oral traditions. All right. And we hear, and this kind of looking for like an origin story. You can ask, there is a way to ask, when is the first time Tulane University gave money to the Mardi Gras Indian Council? That's a knowable thing. When was Mardi Gras Indian Council formed? Go to some Tulane records, you can find that out. This is not that kind of a question. So what have we been doing? Let's see if is community archive work ever pretty? I wanted to honor the people who've actually been doing the work. I meant to have, and I wasn't as a picture of the site, so when you go by it at 4th and LaSalle, go by, you can recognize it. But I did drag up some pictures of what this actually looks like, because I think it's a little bit misleading when we talk about archives, when we just talk about the Indians. The 4 things about how this project came to be go in this order. One of the things that Mr. Butler was very aware of is the way that these kinds of traditions, both the Mardi Gras Indian tradition, which the organization which he founded focuses on, has evolved within Black communities that are long-term under-resourced. And that's true across the Americas. And if you look at and study traditions and organizations in Brazil, in the Caribbean, I'll talk a little bit about one of the community organizations that we're partnered with in the Eastern Caribbean, in terms of, but if you look at these communities, you will find things, not just things that look aesthetically like masking Indians that we see here, but you find organizations and relationships, and you will also find Black communities that people look down on, that are under-resourced. The most interesting news story we came about when we started our research, because we've been doing kind of concentric circles, both around the neighborhood that happens in Central City to be around the council campus. Factual story. All right, factual story. 2 African-American sailors got into a fight in what is now A.L. Davis Park. All right, and they were fighting behind a tree, and one stabbed the other. I think they both lived. This is a serious crime. Stabbing is wrong. That's harm. All right. In response, the city cut down about a half dozen live oaks, because they see these Black people are the kind of people that hide behind trees and stab one another. And I was like, wow, so the scale of what communities are up against. And one of the things that Mr. Butler and the Mardi Gras Indian Council has been attentive to, and part of the reason for creating the organization is created in the 80s. This is in deindustrializing New Orleans. There's a wonderful book written by a Tulane University graduate called New Orleans After the Promises. All right, and it looks at how it looks both economically at the city. And I am not shilling just for Tulane University graduates. It's not a Mardi Gras Indian cultural history kind of piece of reading, but it is at that moment when, like, wait a second, didn't this country just make Kent Germany is the author. He's like, didn't this country just make a whole big bunch of promises that they were going to fight poverty and disempowerment in Black communities? How the heck could you get it so wrong and do so badly for this? And so there was this attentiveness to trying to think about preserving these traditions in this context, in those communities, and how could, and that's where part of the impulse comes from. Individual tribes had their own leadership, had their own records, had their own oral histories, but he's like, is there any way? And that's where the idea comes from. The second thing that everybody, not just in this tradition, were aware of is not just that they didn't have space, and just for the record, this little super renovated space, that's the Mardi Gras Indian Council. That's actually Tulane University Library that I'll say something about in a minute. Was the growth of tourism and public consumption of these traditions. And that likewise is true all over the hemisphere. They said, wait a minute. So now there's a tourist industry that's hiring the people that do these traditions, paying them garbage wages, there I've said it, exploiting them to be servants. May I cite another book that I recommend to my students called Paradise and Plantation, all right, that talks about how, particularly in the Caribbean context, oh, look how beautiful these places are, and like, you know, and what version of servant would you like us to present to you as a tourist? It's this sort of, and a new public consumption of these places as the very communities that's either making the labor possible aren't getting those resources. That's, you know, so that's the other thing at work here. What Mr. Butler's idea was twofold. One was that they would have a physical address, that there would be a place that members of the tradition that shared these concerns. There was a council of chiefs. Mr. Butler himself is not a masking Indian. All right. There's a council of chiefs that they could say, what are we concerned about? What does it mean to keep our own records? This is our physical space. We can meet in it. We can be ourselves and think through what it means to have our tradition preserved. Mr. Butler also had a digital vision. And this is where I say this is where it was born. One of the things that if tourism grew and these traditions became, and this is the disconnect, I think, for a lot of audiences, like, but the city loves Mardi Gras Indians. All right. You know, it's like, you know, young people have taught me this. You love something, pay. All right. You know, it's love, you know, the way you support something and say it is supported is by resources. All right. And I'm not saying that the city of New Orleans or the state of Louisiana or the government necessarily, but this, in many ways, the increased attention to promoting and adoring these traditions in public has created a misperception that there's, you know, a ton of resources behind it. And it's not that there's none. All right. And there are city granting agencies that have worked very hard. But what does it mean for Mardi Gras Indians themselves and people within these communities, mostly middle and working class African Americans? Mr. Butler actually said, one of the things he said the first time I met him was, he's like, look, now with this internet thing, it's not just a tourist. Any tourist can come here with a cell phone and make a video, even a well-considered video, you know, a pretty good, you know, junior from, I don't know, Emory, some lesser institution in Atlanta, and come here on Mardi Gras, make a video, put it on YouTube, explain my culture, my community's culture. And it's up there and people can consume it without even thinking through. And we all know it's easy pickings. And I know I got some archivists on here that there's all kinds of lies on the internet. But he was just like, well, if nothing else, I don't think he used the word duty, but we should make our own content and put it in those spaces. If that's how people are learning these things, you know, and there are some pretty terrible stories, as you all know, and there's some Tulane law professors have been involved in this, of people like, you know, taking pictures of people and selling it for money way more than these people see in 6 months. And that's more importantly than that, Mr. Butler was like, well, if this is how people learn about the tradition, how can we essentially participate in that? The other thing that he was carefully doing was creating his own archive. And what you see the students doing, the principal thing we have been doing is actually there's two things we've been doing. But the principal thing on site is Mr. Butler himself. He's like, anything connected to this tradition, any image, anything, any newspaper clipping, I'm going to keep it. All right. I think I saw, I know I saw Melissa, I may have saw Lee. This is ephemera. And he says, and he would have never said, I'm going to make the archive of Mardi Gras Indian Council ephemera. All right. But this is what you see on the table on that slide. This is literally Mr. Bertrand Butler's archive. All right. And it's an amazing, and in some cases, volunteers have gone and like, where's the original of that image? You know, what's the date on it? Like, and most of this stuff isn't the original valuable thing. All right. But he literally had started this. And essentially, I come to the story late. All right. When people hear about this archiving project, they think that like we went to the council and said like, hey, it's really important to keep your records. Let the lovely smart Tulane help you. Not a thing. All right. They looked at and made their own analysis of what was going on digitally. And I'm an old historian. So like digital humanities, what is that? So that's kind of how we came to the story. I just lost. What we have then done, all right, then, is we've essentially said, we love this partnership. How can we help you make it happen? All right. And there have been essentially, other than helping Mr. Butler get the archives in order and thinking about digital, all right, there have been 4 other little pieces of research content that they've said, help us think about. All right. One is to start getting a big research content that's community-based. And if you go to the site, and shame on me, it's the one, I don't need the images. And I asked Miriam yesterday, like, is this an imagey audience? But I wish you could see the site because it's actually, the council actually acquired 2 buildings. And there's one building that you can visit. There's a conference room there's a small room where they can do sort of sewing demonstrations. And a lot of our students have been through there. A lot of young people have been through there in terms of thinking about what community-based means. And these pictures I can't find, and I really should, shame on me, is that before the building was ready, a lot of this stuff was stored in an agreement they made with A.L. Davis Park. And if you go to the park, there's a building on the corner of the park that's next to the pool, and it had like the football equipment and the balls and the bats and the chairs. And then in the cupboard was the Mardi Gras Indians archive. And I was just like, you know, in some ways, this is, it's on the one hand, it's a beautiful thing. On the other hand, you're like, whoa, if the city cares about, if we as a community, if we as a society, and I listened to some of the other presentations, and there was one about power, and there was some good about what social justice really looks like, and what does it mean in terms of, you know, who hoards what resources. I'm glad the boxes were there, but the fact that this sort of important archive of the Mardi Gras Indian Council was basically in the cupboard with the football equipment. All right, that's a good story, but it's a bad archival practice. One leaky ceiling, one mistake. This is how things get accidentally lost. But one of the things that they want us to think about is like Mr. Butler. He's like, I'm not magical. There's all kinds of families and communities that keep things. And we want to think about an archive. And there is the second building on site. They're going to use it for other things. And they're like, what physical things, even if it's temporary, can we have in the site? So if you go Super Sunday, Uptown Super Sunday, it's like the Sunday after the Tulane Book Fest. What is that, the 17th? I can't remember what the day is. It's close to St. Joseph's Day. But if you go look at the 2 buildings, and if you want to volunteer that day and be really useful, shoot me an email. Their idea is that we can use one of those spaces. Mr. Butler's archive is its own historical thing because that's the vision, and we want to try to think about keeping it intact. I'm going to say something about that in a minute. So that's one of the things, is what does it mean for them at least to say, for anyone to be able to come and say this should be kept. And in fact, this is the kind of thing we've been talking about with them, is like, you know, and he'll say, this picture I kept because he know, like, and great things. I have a couple of students from New Orleans, and they're like, well, wait, that's my aunt. Yeah, she used to be tied to this thing and the next thing, and there's all kinds of things going on. So that's one piece of the research content. The second thing of the research content, and this is where we are trying to at least think through and bring a little bit of, and this is where Professor Hat comes on. I'm a historian. Like, what other primary sources are out there that we don't have? Like we got down a rabbit hole. National Geographic about 40 years ago did a whole thing. Like but they had all these, they had documents and they interviewed people and they were down here poking around and we're like, can we get that stuff? Are there travelers to the city we've overlooked? Like, what are the kind of historical documents? And they want to think about both knowing where it is. It's not like they have to own everything, but they should know it's about them. The other kind of content, and this is what the kind of very boring thing, and I love all of my students because they're wonderful humans, but one of the things that students do is a lot of quite tedious stuff. One of the things that my students have been doing, and I've now had 3 classes go through it, is like, what does the newspaper have to say about these people? And we've literally gone through 50 years of every time the New Orleans Times-Picayune or the New Orleans Advocate mentioned Mardi Gras Indian. We've gone through that from 1971 to 2019 or 2020. I can't remember, but it's 50 full years we've gone through, and we've essentially said we have researchers at a university. We can start making lists of, like, students are not in the position to go running down National Geographic in DC. All right, but they are in a position to be like, what kinds of collections can we build for the council? All right, using our kind of library resources. So that's the third kind of research content that we've done for them, and with them is thinking about, like, what does it mean for our students, for example, to yank down, like, somewhere there should be every academic article ever written in any language about this tradition. What would it mean for the council wants that bibliography? All right, like, yeah, that's and indeed one of the and if I have time I will pull it up. One of the things that we did on a kind of short-term vision of that is that, don't get it wrong, they're starting to do around famous chiefs who've since passed on anniversaries of their birth. One of the things the council is starting to do is trying to put up like little social media notices about this. And so they'll say, can you look up quickly and start like a starter bibliography on this famous chief or that famous chief? But they are aware that that stuff is out there, but they don't have staff and most of that stuff, as most of y'all know, is in these paid databases. And I can use, like, sort of Tulane can use its resources, faculty and students who have both access to these things because of Tulane's money and ability to pay for those databases and time. And then the last piece on that they want with research, and I should scoot back to my previous slide, is that they said to us, we want international learning. All right, even before the pandemic put us all on Zoom, they're like, we want ways to connect, and they would say on FaceTime or something, so we could chat with the person who is like us in Montserrat. Like, and they like, I want to say Chief Casby's son was in Belize. Like, we want to have conversations with these people. All right. And one of the things that's written into the grant is, and we still, because of the pandemic and Ida, we haven't yet been able to pull it off, is most New Orleanians and most members of this tradition, thousands of people, are not going to be able to travel to those places. But, and say, like, I visited, a young man who's making his 8th suit. He doesn't have the chance to go visit the creator in Belize or in, Trinidad. But they said one of the things that they hope once they have a bigger digital footprint, all right, is to be able to have those connections work. And that was them saying to us, can you help us make this work? Okay, so to wrap up and just actually now start talking nuts and bolts. And what the heck what have you actually been doing other than sitting around counting things? One of the things that, and this sadly is the last image is terribly boring. But I'm kind of I used to tease people that people treat software, because I'm analog. I was born 1967, so I remember a life when none of this crap existed. And then every time something new comes along, it's like someone's joined a new church. And they're like, no, the best kind of Christianity is United Methodist. You must come to this church with me. Or like, I've just learned from someone, and I don't eat meat, so I wouldn't know that the best crawfish is apparently in Marrero a couple weeks from now. So it just it's some kind of cook-off. And apparently, so I always swore I would never be that person. But Omeka is one of these, it's web publishing platform for exhibits and this kind of thing. And one of the big things we've been doing is, what does it mean to be sustainable? And you do have to start somewhere. And one of the things that Mr. Butler, which is really the reason he's become my new favorite person, is he's like, he hates people just, quote, throwing stuff up online. All right. And he says, I don't want good, like, and I was like, yeah, you and me both. All right. And that we don't want to make things that are good looking unless they are well researched, that we've thought about whether they're easy to use, and is this the right tool for what we are doing it. Like, so you can build a site with WordPress, but is that the best site for what we want to do? And one of the things to uplift for faculty who are on this call, one of the things that, and I would say that it was probably profoundly dissatisfying for the students that did this. All right. But one summer we had 2 interns. All right. And all they did was mess around with WordPress and Omeka and try out plugins. All right, on WordPress. And I was supposed to have a nasty little image of WordPress with whom I'm having a billing dispute. So they are mine enemy. But we had the students literally, because who has time to do this? I, as a faculty member with all this research stuff. And this is, I said, for students, I don't think they felt like my students who were at that Acorn workshop where I started, and they're talking to New Orleans family and walking them through what the most recent housing flyer is and what new nonprofit is in town. That feels incredibly tangibly useful. And what I tell my students engaged in this project is, you come back for your 10th reunion, or you click on, and when you open up the Mardi Gras Indian Council's site, know that the frustrating time you've spent figuring out that Brazilian hyena can plugin was going to be too hard to train volunteers to use. All right. And so that's one of the things that we have been doing. This really should have a slide. Is that the other thing we have been doing, and it's the thing that has made this possible, is that we have, get it right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 robust partners. All right. One is the Amistad Research Center that I'll say a little bit more about, that they basically have. Amistad Research Center is an independent Black archive. It is a professional archive. It is hosted at Tulane, but it is an independent organization. But because they are friends of the importance of keeping the records of Black freedom, they basically have let me mostly call them up on a moment's notice and say, be our consultant on this fact about physical archiving. Like, if we're going to sort Mr. Butler's stuff, where should we put the number? All right. Yay. God, what is the name of the student? Because he came up with a macro that would automatically put things in the spreadsheet a certain way in terms of form. The other, the Life Code Lab, life, like the word, and this is where I do need an image, and I regret not having it, at Johns Hopkins University, is a huge digital humanities operation run by a bunch of historians and lit scholars. And they have brought us in as a partner and said, you can kind of sit in on our lab presentations, and we can pool resources and you can participate in workshops. And they have sub labs, and the Black Southern Cultures Lab, a Hopkins grad student, actually said, okay, if you're going to choose Omeka, it's a Hopkins graduate student that said, I know enough, and I'm interested in Black Southern cultures. I will make up a mock site so that Mr. Butler can see this is what it's going to look like. And a graduate student who's almost got a PhD and has worked on this for 5 years can do something a service learner cannot. All right. That intern was funded by the Stone Center for Latin American Studies, because they're like, when this thing is live and we're making all these Caribbean connections, and they took the long view. This is hard archiving work. They didn't say, unless she is making a Caribbean thing, Stone Center money cannot do this. They're like, no, we see the vision. We see the vision of the council. We see the vision of the project. So if they need a mock-up, that's what they get. All right. And she did an internship with me in the summer. And it wasn't like I wasn't showing her anything. She did the work. The Newcomb Digital Lab has likewise been a huge partner, helping us with some of these decisions. And it was, in fact, a Newcomb intern that we glommed onto the experimental stuff. Looking at my time, because I give myself 4 minutes. In terms of the other sort of extra partner here, and I use the term partner right before I get to sort of tools and where we stand, is that the Tulane library system is a partner, but one of our big struggles has been, it's more that because we are connected to Tulane, we can access these things. All right. And that's one of the things that we have been talking about with the council. And indeed, we just now are to the point of talking about legally is what kinds of access, and we actually are trying to study the law on what things that we have access to via Tulane, because Tulane pays Newsbank to have access to a Pittsburgh Courier story about Black culture in New Orleans. You know, can we then essentially give that to the council on an Omeka exhibit and have it online in perpetuity for the free access of anyone who walks into the Mardi Gras Indian Council? Because that is their vision, that like, you know, a kid who is 20 and says, you know, my grandfather used to do this, you know, back in the 80s. You know, what do you have? They have a vision of not having all the objects there, but being this kind of gateway. And we are now we're just now at that point of trying to look at like, what in fact does the law say? And, you know, circle back. Okay, so to wrap up, where we stand now, the archive building is almost finished. We have the biggest failure we had, and it's mine, but it's also Ida, is that we actually came up with like, if we're going to temporarily store some of Mr. Butler's ephemera, Amistad basically told us how to shop for stuff. And we're basically going to see what it feels like to try to actually have stuff on site. What is our climate control? And this is actually doing that stuff. The second thing that's going on that's really independent with the council is that they do have their own equipment to do their own interviewing, create their own videos. And they're like, you know, everybody's doing this, so we will create our own. And there's a handful of Tulane interns, the people that were in 2020, with right before, what is that thing, the pandemic, were helping with that. So they are already, and that's super important, they're creating and curating their own content. And all we have done is Tulane for that is essentially said, here are interns. Please do what the council needs you to do. We have made a tool decision that Omeka is the forum we're going to use for our exhibit because it's small enough and it will last 10 years, may not last forever. Everybody likes it. And indeed, my high point as a historian is when I showed the director and assistant director some random sites about like slavery stuff that had been built with Omeka. They're like, yeah, that's what we want to do. Because you can both build a creative exhibit about Super Sunday, but you can also essentially then let users of the site be like, this is where we got the stuff from. And if you want to skim through the whole Times-Picayune for the weekend of Super Sunday in 1999, here's how you do it. We have a lot of starter content in terms of the newspaper research, the content that the council has created itself. Where we're kind of stuck as we come sort of to the formal end of our initial grant period is how to think about content creation beyond this. All right, like both in terms of, you know, do they want perpetually to have interns running down primary sources? You know, what sets of relationships with what archives once they find stuff? And because they are unstaffed, what does that mean? Like we pick the newspapers because it's an easy thing, student access. The big stumbling block is where's the training thing? Our role here has mostly been using Tulane resources and Tulane students and partnerships that we can build through Hopkins and Life Code to get all kinds of, you know, technical training on making decisions. Like that's too hard. All right. And we haven't solved that problem yet. I'm glad that I got Melissa's video back. We've been thinking about partnerships and what does that mean long-term? Not the partnerships that we've kind of built with this grant that are some Tulane, but some beyond Tulane. One of our trainings on how to do community archiving was done by Create Caribbean, which is an entity founded at a community college in the Eastern Caribbean by a brilliant DH scholar that we hope to get in residence at Tulane at some point. But how do we build those up? Like, what does that look like long-term beyond the grant? All right, if this is going to work. And I think the last thing where I'm going to end is that this is also about relationship building. And that's why it's going to take a long time. There's a lot of technical parts here. And if we wanted to, we could apply for external money and literally I could get a raft of money. Well, I'm not saying like I'm so clever, but we could find a way to get a raft of money to say, pay a bunch of postdocs to do a bunch of work and build an Omeka, like an Omeka classic site that has all kinds of stuff. And then, sort of say to the council, okay, that's your starter. And we've been trying to do this in a way that is more walking beside people and walking slow. And that's been hard because it often feels very dissatisfying. And once the assistant director said to me, like, a lot of things were going wrong. And he's like, I'm going out of town. He has a day job. He's a volunteer too. He's like, I'm going out of town for 10 days. Like, just go by the center and just talk, just talk to Mr. Butler. He doesn't know you very well. Like, you're a random stranger, even after 3 years. And he said, you got to remember to do that. And that's, and it's been so that's kind of where we are. I'm happy to talk questions. We can stop the share. I can show you some of the things that students have been playing around with Omeka, and the council likes it. They're like, oh, that's how it works. But it's really, I have high hopes. The site will be real, the archive site will be real, but it is incredibly slow. And my biggest learning is how much they value the archives. My biggest challenge has been recognizing we've got one person's ephemera, and there's all this stuff out there and all of these questions about, one of the things with the council is like, someone may come in there with something incredibly valuable and they may say that really should go, to Amistad, and it's complicated, and they're not the boss of all things Indian. And one of the things they envision also is that through whatever digital portal they have, they could say to Mohawk hunters, here, Mohawk hunters, here's your site, do whatever you want with it. Keep Mohawk hunters things on it. Like, they're not, that's the other reason, that's the other thing they said, and I forgot to say, is that the thing they like about digital, it's a way for them to say, hey, anyone out there in this community who wants this digital doorway, can we be not just a physical space, but one where you can essentially walk in to our digital platform. Last thing for the tech people here is we still have not solved the hosting thing. I forgot to say that with the Omeka, is that we really want it, obviously not on a Tulane server. We want it on the Mardi Gras Indian Council's current site is on GoDaddy. But that's where you have, like, the technical weeds get complicated and there's money involved. But we want it freestanding. Thank you all for listening to me talk too much.
Thank you so much, Rosanne. Well, let's open it up for questions, comments. Please feel free to unmute yourselves or, write your questions in the chat.
Y'all really have no questions? I can just start bringing up videos from Antigua where we're going, but want to come? I haven't figured out how to go to Antigua, but I'm shilling for all of my new favorite things. Reclaim hosting, they tell me, for those of you that have a particular, people on this presentation who have, how do you call it? Digital ambitions. One of the things is that they say that reclaim hosting, it's economical, it has good support. Yes, hi Cherise, is it this? I think CPS puts them on their YouTube channel.
Absolutely. I will share in a few days, I will share a follow-up email with everyone who registered and who is on this call. And you'll have access to the recording and other prior sessions. Absolutely.
Yeah. And the one thing, and I will, Samantha, I see your hand. I will say about the Antigua thing, since I brought it up, is one of the things we've been thinking about is, and this is interesting, where I said way back when, is that these things develop organically. It's not just the Christian calendar of it all. So what has happened in Antigua is that Antigua has a Trinidad-style pre-Lenten carnival in the summer for the celebration of the ending of slavery. All right. And it's a bit like if somewhere else had Mardi Gras style, celebrations, in, I don't know, let's pick a town in Auburn, Alabama for Juneteenth. All right. And they're like, we don't have any Juneteenth traditions. A bunch of New Orleanians are here, or in Houston, and one of the things though that they really have, they reproduce in Antigua, which has some of the same history, but didn't have a big pre-Lenten carnival, but then are in dialogue with Trinidad's carnival, is they have something that really mimics Trinidad's pre-Lenten carnival, but they do it in the summer around Emancipation Day. And I don't fully understand the history of it. I did not know March Romani had the same mimicking. Yeah, that's fascinating, Emma. Because one of the things that we've been talking about is that we do want to use a little bit of Tulane's money, and it's in the grant for some people in council leadership to actually go into the Caribbean and actually have some analog time and actually start to build some relationships, because we have a tentative relationship with a woman from Dominica that has its own pre-Lenten carnival that's pretty elaborate, and it's her Create Caribbean, which I'll put their link in the chat. But Samantha, you had a question.
So I was typing because I do have to hop off, but I just wanted to sincerely express gratitude for the ways you're working and elevating the history of this tradition. You know, as a New Orleans native, as the daughter of a Black masking Indian, it's what you're doing is so needed, and I'm sure you know this well, because even for many New Orleans natives, we don't know the depth and the extent of this history within New Orleans, let alone across the African diaspora. So I just wanted to express my gratitude for that personally.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I wish I had more time for it. That's the most frustrating thing, but it's really the council's vision. They said, look, we have to find a way, because the oral tradition is wonderful, but we have to find a way to make this, and to even see my students, someone who are connected, and they're like, whoa, this is amazing. Create Caribbean was our partner, and she is a true DH expert and utterly brilliant. But she said that her first experience doing this was that she had an uncle who was some kind of political activist. And he was like, you've been to all that school, literally, can you help me organize my papers? And she did a Friday afternoon workshop via Zoom for us, with students to think about like what does it mean to scan stuff? What do you scan stuff? Why are you doing it? How do you organize it? What are sort of best practices and principles? But also the other thing to think about, she did a little bit of walkthrough on minimal computing, and you don't want stuff to Dr. Francois's point, we also want something that's a load easy on a phone. All right, so that somebody who doesn't have a lot of money, and if they are interested in this tradition and they have the phone that was on sale at Cricket, we want this stuff to load easy. All right, even if they have T-Mobile, all right, which can just about make a phone call as near as I can tell, if you ask it nicely. And that's the other thing. And my favorite, my funniest moment was the students were like, this is hard. And I've been with her in other workshops, and she's like, your teacher is 40 years older than you. If I can teach her this stuff, surely you can learn it. And I was like, thank you for aging me, but yes, this is true. Other questions? Y'all are question free. You'll just want to go to Antigua with me, don't you? I know you do. I know you do. We had such big dreams. For any of you who are applying for CPS grants, cut your dreams in half. Maybe cut them in 8. That's my sincere recommendation to you. This is the thing the last thing that I absolutely want to share. We are all smarter and better and more ethical because of our Life Code partnership. And it's Life Code that's taught us a lot. It's not just that they provided it is through the Life Code partnership and the Black Southern Cultures Lab, which is one of their labs, that we actually got the intern who did the work. All right, but it's really, they are our models and teachers for ethical practice in terms of, thinking at every step what it means for people to have control of their own stuff. They have been just, kind of our cheerleaders to some of the stuff that Samantha said. And like, a lot of my, the nice thing about the CPS grant, everything slowed down because we had pandemic, and then we had Ida, and like just craziness, like even when we were back, like then with the pandemic, because this is a tradition with so many older people involved in it, we're not having show and tell at the cultural campus, bringing a bunch of 20-somethings who've been on planes into contact with a bunch of people 65 to 85. That's not ethical. And also with the, one of our partners was in a building that was damaged from Ida and out of their home for 7 months. And so it's like, hey partner, do stuff. Hey partner, don't do stuff. And one of the things, often I feel a little bit disconnected, and students, it's been a learning curve for me. On the one hand, and Sergio helped me with this, we talked about what can we do to get students to work? We cannot, in the midst of when they needed the hours finished, they needed meaningful work. And that's one of the things with some of the more kind of digital academic article, newspapery type research, that we actually could set students to work with that at moments that we just couldn't safely be in person. But then you often get a little bit of a disconnect where students are like, oh, I can do this without actually having to challenge myself by being a space where I'm unfamiliar, and actually building relationships with people. And one of my most beautiful reflections, and I will say this, I don't think Jelligat's here, some of Jelligat's, Terry, who's in bio, our EEOB students also do a lot of gardening and environmental work at the cultural campus site. They called out some of my students, so your skills in equity and respect are lower than ours. And I was just like, on the one hand, I'm not sure they were wrong, but I didn't like their approach in being critical. But a student wrote a long reflection about that. And he actually said that. He said, that's the challenge with this work. You're doing something incredibly useful if you're mucking around on Omeka in your room. But you have to grow as a human intellectually to think about what those relationships are. And it's hard. It's incredibly time consuming. And I do think that that's one of the things that that we really need to think about in this, in terms of particularly the archival work and, the people who work in archives here, this is hard, time consuming stuff. And it is useful to have students do that stuff that is straight tedious for credit, because there is no socialist revolution that is coming to save community archives. So the world in which someone, Philip Cunningham, who used to be at Amistad, said that if everybody on earth, every adult who's currently an adult on earth stopped their jobs and just said, we're going to digitize what's at the New Orleans Mint. That's our job. The government's going to provide us food and housing. And it would take something like 80 years, if every human on earth. All right. It's just, so figuring out how to do this and make good use of that tedium while also actually building healthy relationships. And that's why the step of what content we want and how we build it, it's hard, but it's rewarding stuff. And I some days this is my work, fascinating, but this is my work.
Thank you so much, Rosanne. A couple of people added some comments, positive and gratitude for your presentation.
Yeah.
Unless there are other comments or questions, we're going to wrap up. As I said, I'll have a follow-up email with the link to the recording and a brief survey with tapping into your ideas for future sessions in the CPS speaker series.
Yeah. And I will say something for the people who are still here, and for Miriam, one of the things that Life Code suggested, because I know the grant said that they want the researcher, the Tulane person who wrote it, to produce an article out of it. One of the things that Life Code team said, could we maybe produce a white paper that is, you know, and we got Lee Miller, we got Melissa on here about is because I can write an article. Like, you know, I have a degree in how to write an academic article, like, you know, and I could do some stuff about the Trinidad Black Indians. I could do all kinds of things. But they said, is there a way that maybe our experience with this? Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. 4,000 person years. This, like, people don't get that. Like, can't you just digitize this? Like, you have no idea what you're saying. Yeah. It's a but to, like, to actually think about that white paper seriously, maybe that's something that like a consortium of New Orleanians and Tulanians, because I think New Orleans is in many ways the bridge between the wealthy global North and the global South. So the kind of white paper we could reproduce, produce here might be really helpful. So fantastic. Thank y'all for the opportunity.
Thank you and goodbye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, Dr. Adderley.